I'm going to be covering some of the basic equipment and techniques you need to know for watercolor. Today we're going to just start with understanding our tools. We've got some brushes, we've got water, we've got a paint palette. This is a Praying watercolor. I've got my paper, which is a watercolor paper. It's practice paper, so it's not as expensive. Alright, so the first thing I want to talk about is what kind of watercolor brushes you need. It's really important that you get some sort of natural or natural synthetic fiber blend. That's kind of a little bit confusing because it doesn't really tell you what the brush should look like. But if you have a really good watercolor brush, it's going to have nice soft bristles. That when they're dry, they're going to look kind of fluffy and separated. But as soon as you dip it into water, it should return to a nice sharp point and all the bristles should come back together. That's really important if you have those bristles coming back together into a point. With a brush that's more of a nylon synthetic brush, if you dip it into water, so some of them are still going to stick out possibly, and it's not going to hold as much water for you. It's, I think, sometimes easier to tell the difference when you're actually using it rather than it is visually, because, you know, sometimes once they're wet, they kind of look very similar. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you how the watercolor brush looks first, and I'm just going to dip it into some paint and water, scraping off the brush so it's not completely saturated, and I'm going to brush all the way across my paper, and I still have a little bit of water left, so I'm going to continue. And now at this point it's getting really light and I can see that some of the paper is starting to show through. So that's how long my watercolor brush lasted. I'm going to dip my nylon brush in the same process, drawing it off a little bit so it's not completely saturated. And now I'm going to pull here, and I'm going to, already you can see that there is less paint and there's a lot of dry paper showing through. So I was barely able to get through one stroke with the nylon brush. These types of synthetic brushes are really great for doing acrylic, but not so much when you're working with watercolor. So now that you have your brushes and you've got a couple of different shapes, you've got a pointed one and there's a flat brush. The flat brushes are really good for doing washes, whereas the pointed brushes are better for getting in and doing smaller areas and details. Before I go into any specific techniques, I want to talk about how to mix our paint. I want to mix my water into my paint, and I kind of gently brush. I'm not scrubbing, I'm not squishing my brush down into there. I don't want to ruin the bristles. I want to make sure I'm always kind of going with the grain of the bristles, and I'm going to pull some of that paint out and put it into my palette. I'm going to need a little bit more water. Right now, I have a fairly good amount of paint, about an even amount of paint with some water, and I'm going to paint in my intense area here. The more color I come in, the more bright it's going to look, and as I go down, I'm going to add a little bit more water. And as I add just water, notice that the paint becomes less saturated and lighter. About mixing our colors from our palette, it's really important not just to use the colors that you have available to you. Watercolor is great for mixing. So I'm going to go ahead, I already have some blue out here, I'm going to go ahead and add some of the purple, because I think it's really important that as you're working that you're constantly using multiple different colors. When I mix those two colors, I get a much greater variety and greater richness when I'm painting. For example, if I just use green from my palette, I think it doesn't look all that interesting. But if I were to mix it with my purple-blue mixture that I already have here, I can make a much more interesting green, almost like a natural pine tree green. So don't forget to mix your colors. You don't have to mix them completely on your palette, and you don't even have to mix them at all on your palette. Sometimes I might even come in and just grab a color and add it on top of what I've already painted and allow the colors to mix themselves. So we have two types of edges with watercolor. We have soft edges and we have hard edges. If I just paint directly on my dry paper and I let this dry, the edge between the color and the paper is going to be very crisp and distinct. Okay? Now, if I want to create a soft edge and I start on my dry paper, what I need to do is I need to then rinse my brush. I can actually soften that edge by taking a little bit of water on my brush, and notice how I'm using my paper towel to kind of control how much water is in my brush. I can come along that edge and just soften it up a little bit. And what happens is that water dissolves the paint and allows the paint to kind of pull to the right here so that it's mixing a little bit more with the paper. And I think that one of the things people run into is if they are painting and they're using a lot of water and they keep moving from space to space without letting the previous layer dry. So I'm going to show you kind of what that looks like. I'm going to be painting a sphere here, and I'm going to be painting it blue and probably with some greens. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of paint the whole thing without letting any of the previous layers dry first. You can see how anytime that edge hits another wet edge, those two edges pull together and it becomes soft. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to paint the same colors, but this time I'm going to do the sphere first, and I'm going to let it dry before I go into doing the cast shadow. Okay, I've given it some time. I've let my sphere dry. I can tell that it's dry because the paper is no longer shiny. Time to go ahead and create my background. You can really see the edges are much more distinguished and defined. So it's really important to kind of be thinking about where you want your edges to be hard, where you want your edges to be soft, and keep in mind how wet your paper is as you work.